What if the demons you were taught to fear were never monsters lurking outside, but encrypted codes written into the marrow of your own being? What if every strange spiral etched into an ancient grimoire, every sigil burned into wax or tattooed on forgotten skin, was not art, not madness, but a key and access point to a hidden operating system of reality? You've lived in a half-world. The one built for you, curated, flattened, and sterilized. The one where symbols mean marketing, where ritual means routine, where fear keeps you obedient. But there is another layer. Silent, symbolic, relentless. A layer mapped not by priests or scientists, but by magicians. The Ars Goetia was never a monster manual. It was never fairy tales or the scribbles of lunatics. It is a blueprint, a codebook, a survival guide for those willing to pierce the veil. The seals it contains are not decorations, they are portals. Each curve, each intersection, each line holds frequency, resonance, intention. When traced, they don't just represent a spirit, they summon it. And when that spirit rises, you realize the most forbidden truth of all. It has always lived inside you. The world told you to laugh at this, to dismiss it as superstition, to reduce it to fantasy. But laughter is often a mask for fear. So when fear is the first reflex when standing before something your mind cannot categorize. The question is not whether spirits are real. The question is whether you are ready to see what they reveal about the world, about power, and about yourself. Behind every empire of stone, every kingdom of blood, every cathedral that lifts its spire into the clouds, there's a darker foundation. Hidden architecture not built from bricks or mortar, but from seals, names, and contracts whispered into smoke. The Ars Goetia maps this invisible order with the precision of an engineer. It does not speak in the language of myths, but in hierarchies, kings who command legions, dukes who marshal armies, presidents who govern domains, marquises who oversee borders. To the uninitiated, these ranks sound medieval. It's like the trappings of an old superstition, yet their structure mirrors something far more universal. Power always organizes itself. In governments, in corporations, in armies, in religions, authority flows downward. From sovereign to subordinate, from center to edge. The Goetia simply reveals the same law at work in the unseen. Imagine a kingdom without land, a parliament without walls, a chain of command stretching into the abyss. When a name is spoken, when a sigil is drawn, it is not a game. It is a petition across dimensions, a call to an intelligence that holds a role, a station, a function in this architecture. Each spirit, whether crowned king or obscure servitor, occupies a node in a vast network, a wiring diagram of consciousness itself. And this is why the grimoires insist on protocol. You do not approach a king without authority. You do not summon a duke without the correct words. Ritual is not superstition, it is jurisdiction. The circle of protection is not a child's chalk drawing. It is a throne room, a declaration of your position in this structure. When the old magicians stepped into the circle, they were not play acting. They were aligning themselves with a chain of authority older than scripture, invoking names that reached beyond angels, beyond divinity itself, almed into the primordial laws by which reality bends. Every detail mattered. The planetary hour, the consecrated tools, the purifications and prayers. These were not decorations. They were signatures on a cosmic contract, binding the unseen to recognize the magician's authority. Without them, the architecture collapses and chaos rushes in. Think of how earthly systems mirror this. A judge does not speak as a man or woman. They speak with the weight of the court, with law itself standing behind every syllable. A general does not command through personal charisma alone. They wield the authority of the state, of the chain of command. Remove those structures, and their words are just noise. The Goetia reveals that the same applies in the invisible. Authority is not taken, it is recognized. Spirits do not bend because you shout louder. They respond because you stand aligned with the architecture, because you step into the place carved for you by ritual. This is the architecture of evil, not in the sense of wickedness, but in the sense of power hidden, shadowed, inverted from the light of consensus. It is evil only because it exists outside the sanctioned order, outside the narratives that domesticate the sacred. For centuries, the church told you this structure was demonic, dangerous, forbidden. But look closely at its own hierarchy. Popes, cardinals, bishops, priests. Is it so different? Look at the state. Presidents, ministers, officials, clerks. Look at corporations, CEOs, directors, managers, workers. Power repeats its geometry everywhere, a fractal chain of command. The Goetia merely unmasks the version that stretches behind the veil, the one that does not end with men in robes or kings on thrones, but continues downward and inward into intelligences older than humanity itself. To work with this architecture is to step into its geometry, to recognize that the world you thought was solid is threaded by invisible currents of allegiance and command. And here lies the danger and the allure, because once you glimpse this order, you begin to see it everywhere. The anthem sung before the game, the oath sworn before the court, the slogan repeated in the factory, they are all echoes of ritual hierarchy. They bind, they align, they enforce. The difference is that the rituals of the system enslave, while the rituals of the Goetia liberate. One asks for obedience, the other offers sovereignty. Yet sovereignty is perilous. To step into the circle is to risk confrontation with forces that do not care for your comfort or safety. They will not flatter your ego. They will test your clarity, your will, your alignment. They will not bow unless you embody the law that binds them. And if you falter, they will not hesitate to expose your weakness. This is why the architecture is feared, why it was buried beneath sermons and burned beneath inquisitions. Because those who master it no longer require permission. They no longer bend to priests, to kings, to bosses. They learn to bend reality itself. And a society built on obedience cannot allow that knowledge to circulate. The architecture of evil is not a temple in the desert or a secret society plotting in shadows. It is the invisible wiring beneath every act of power, every hierarchy you have ever bowed to. It is the geometry of command, hidden in sigils, encrypted in seals, waiting for those who dare to read it. Once you read it, you cannot return to ignorance. You see the throne rooms hidden in circles of chalk, the contracts hidden in whispered names, the courts of law mirrored in the hierarchies of spirits. You see that the architecture was never theirs to give you or deny you. It was always there, humming beneath your skin, waiting to be remembered. In the beginning was not the word, but the mark. Before alphabets, before law, before scripture, humanity carved lines into stone and bone, tracing spirals in dust, burning shapes into wood and flesh. Those marks were never mere decorations. They were signals, coordinates, attempts to bridge the invisible with the visible. The Ars Goetia preserves this tradition with ruthless clarity. Each sigil, each seal etched onto ancient parchment, is not random ornamentation but encoded intention, geometry carrying vibration. Look closely and you see spirals that seem to turn inward, like whirlpools. Intersections sharp as blades, arcs that suggest orbit and eclipse. To the untrained eye, they appear as chaos, doodles of the mad. But to those who understand, they are instruments. Instruments of resonance. Imagine a tuning fork struck in silence. Air vibrates. Invisible waves shape the room. Sigils do the same, but instead of tuning sound, they tune consciousness. When a magician traces a seal with ink, with ash, with the tip of a blade across candle wax, they're not drawing art. They are keying into a frequency, programming awareness like code slipped into a machine. The seal is not the spirit. It is the lock that opens onto the spirit. And the spirit itself is not an external monster, but an archetype, an energy, a raw current waiting to flow. This is why the ancients never confused symbols with decoration. To them, symbols were technology, ritual technology. The circle of protection is a firewall. The triangle of manifestation is a docking port. The sigil is an access key. Each curve is data, each intersection a command line. Centuries before our computers, our circuits, our neural mapping, they already knew the nervous system of reality could be hacked through form and symbol. But the true potency of a symbol is not only external, it is internal. When you trace a sigil, you do not simply summon something outside. You activate the resonance inside, the part of your psyche that corresponds to the spirit encoded in that geometry. Draw the seal of Asmodeus, and you awaken the shadowed fire of lust, magnetism, creativity within. Trace the sigil of Ammon, and you stir the forces of conflict and reconciliation, already buried in your heart. The symbol is a mirror, and the mirror does not lie. This is why symbols were feared, why they were burned, why they were forbidden. Because they bypass doctrine and pierce directly into the subconscious, into the strata of the soul where programming truly takes root. Words can be argued, dismissed, translated, distorted. A symbol strikes deeper, bypasses the rational mind, bypasses the critic, and strikes directly into the primal layers of being. That is why corporations today spend billions designing logos. That is why nations wrap identities around flags. That is why religions build cathedrals that drip with imagery and geometry, because the mind bends to symbol long before it bends to argument. You may not believe in a triangle etched on old parchment, but your subconscious responds to it. Just as it responds to the glowing logos on your phone, the golden arches above your street, the emblems on uniforms that command instant submission. These are all echoes of the same language, the language of symbols. The difference is intent. Corporate logo enslaves attention, binding you to consumption. A sigil liberates, aligning you with forces older than history, awakening potentials you were taught to fear. But symbols are double-edged. To handle them without understanding is to invite distortion. Just as code written incorrectly corrupts a program, a sigil drawn without precision bends intention into chaos. This is why grimoires insisted on ritual clarity, on purified ink, consecrated tools, sacred timing. They knew the psyche is not neutral. It amplifies what you bring. Draw with confusion, and you summon confusion. Trace with arrogance, and you summon arrogance. Approach with clarity, and the geometry becomes a mirror polished enough to reveal what was always there. Think of the ancient magicians hunched over candlelight, ash falling from incense, quill scratching parchment. They were not artists, they were engineers of the invisible. Each curve carved intention into matter, each line stitched vibration into form. And when the sigil was complete, it was not simply a drawing. It was a door. To gaze upon it was to stand at the threshold of a frequency. To chant its name was to turn the key. And when the air thickened, when the shadows moved, when the dreams grew strange, they understood they had tuned themselves into contact. The danger and the beauty of symbols is that they cannot be unseen. Once you grasp their language, you begin to see it everywhere. In the architecture of cities, in the brands that colonize your imagination, in the flags unfurled at war, in the chants repeated in stadiums and churches. Every curve, every gesture, every repeated form is a sigil. You realize you have been living inside spells, not of your making. The world itself is written in a script you were never taught to read. But once you begin, once the language of symbols unlocks, the veil thins, patterns emerge in chaos. Logos reveal their occult roots. Rituals of state and corporation bleed into rituals of temple and circle. And suddenly you see that you were never free of symbols. They were always shaping you. The only question is, will you keep letting others write them, or will you learn to inscribe your own? Long before coins were minted, long before paper was pressed and stamped with symbols of kings, there was only one currency that the gods, the spirits, and the unseen world would accept: blood. It dripped from altars, pooled beneath temples, soaked the soil of battlefields, and stained the knives of ritual. To the modern eye, sacrifice looks like barbarism, primitive superstition, the cruelty of forgotten ages. But those who lived closer to the abyss knew a truth: we have forgotten blood is not just liquid. It is life condensed, a current of vitality carrying the codes of being. Every heartbeat is an offering. Every drop spilled is a transaction. The ancients understood this with terrifying clarity. When they slit the throat of a lamb or burned the body of a dove, it was not theater, it was exchange. The smoke carried the essence upward, the blood seeped downward, and the invisible currents of power were stirred. In the Goetia, this logic survives, but transformed. You are not asked to burn animals upon altars. You are asked for sacrifice of another kind: your fear, your time, your hunger, your will. Blood has always meant more than red liquid. It is the symbol of all that costs you something real. It is what hurts to give. That is why sacrifice is universal. It is not cruelty for cruelties. Seika is recognition that power flows where something is surrendered. Even now you bleed, though not with knives. You bleed hours into a job that drains your spirit. You bleed attention into screens that feed on your gaze. You bleed energy into systems that never love you back. Blood is the oldest currency because it is still being spent every day, in forms so subtle you no longer recognize the altar. Every time you wake tired, every time you collapse into bed drained, some unseen priest has collected his due. This is why the language of blood persists across myth and scripture. The Hebrews marked their doors with lamb's blood to ward off the angel of death. Christians exalt a crucifixion where divine blood redeems. Pagans scattered it across fields to awaken fertility. Always the same truth. Blood is exchange. Blood is contract. Blood is the bridge between seen and unseen. But here lies the darker insight. The spirits of the Goetia are not moved by sentiment or ritual theater. They respond to resonance, and resonance always costs. When you approach a seal casually, without sacrifice, it lies inert. When you approach with true surrender, it awakens. This does not mean cutting your skin or spilling crimson upon the floor. It means offering something alive from within your comfort, your fear, your illusions, your resistance. God. To give blood is to give essence. To work with the Goetia is to trade essence for alignment. Think of how modern systems mirror this hidden economy. The bank does not ask for ritual slaughter. It asks for your hours, your sleep, your future, bound in debt. The corporation does not cut your flesh. It drains your life in endless cycles of labor. The nation does not drink from chalices. It collects blood in trenches, in wars fought for flags. You are still sacrificing. You are still bleeding. The difference is that your sacrifices no longer awaken you, they enslave you. The magician reclaims this currency. To trace a sigil is to declare, my blood will not be spent in ignorance. My sacrifice will not feed the machine. It will feed the transformation of my own being. This is why the rituals of the Goetia demand preparation. Fasting, purification, nights of discipline, these are sacrifices. They hurt. They demand blood, not always from veins, but from desire, from ego, from comfort. The circle is drawn not with ink alone, but with the hours denied to sleep, the cravings denied to flesh. The blood you offer is the part of you that resists change. And when it burns upon the unseen altar, something awakens. The air thickens, the room tilts, the whisper of presence enters. You realize that nothing comes for free. To call a spirit, to unlock a seal, to shift the architecture of reality, you must pay. And the payment is blood, whether red in the vein or hidden in the marrow of your choices. This is why power is terrifying, because to hold it, you must bleed for it, not once, but continually. Power is not inherited by wish, it is purchased by offering. The ancients spilled animals. You spill pieces of yourself. Time will hunger, silence. Every magician knows this. If nothing has been sacrificed, nothing has been gained. And the most dangerous sacrifice is not external, it is internal. It's the part of you that clings to illusions, the part that trembles at shadow, the part that fears sovereignty. These are the veins you must cut. And when the blood flows, when the sacrifice is real, the spirits answer. Not because they are cruel, but because you have spoken in the only currency they respect, the oldest currency, the eternal exchange. Blood is price, blood is bridge, blood is seal. And until you understand this, every ritual is theater. Once you understand it, every heartbeat is invocation. Every sacrifice bleeds into a larger truth. No ritual is complete without an agreement. The seal is drawn, the offering given, but what follows is always a pact. Humanity has feared this word, twisting it into the legend of Faust selling his soul to Mephistopheles, of witches signing grim oaths in blood, of magicians chained by their bargains. Yet behind the terror is a sober recognition. Power is never free. To invoke, to summon, to command, is to enter into contract with forces that do not yield without exchange. The Goetia is built upon this hidden legal system, a structure of cosmic law more ancient than parchment or courtroom. Every spirit bears a name, a rank, a seal. To call that name is to acknowledge its jurisdiction. To trace that seal is to place yourself inside the court of the unseen. The magician does not beg, but neither does he take. He negotiates. He offers time, attention, discipline, clarity. He receives insight, transformation, resonance. It is a contract as binding as any written in ink, but enforced by resonance itself. This is why the ancients warned, never summon casually. To enter the circle is to sign unseen lines. To utter the name is to ink a covenant in vibration. There is no such thing as neutrality. Here you either stand as sovereign negotiator, or you stand as debtor chained. Think of how earthly systems mirror this. When you accept a loan, you do not simply receive money, you bind yourself to a future of payments. When you accept a job, you sign more than paper. You pledge hours, energy, obedience. Every contract is an invisible ritual, every signature a seal, every clause an invocation. Modernity tells you you are free, yet you are bound by dozens of contracts. Financial, social, digital. You click I agree without reading, and already your consent fuels machinery. The magician simply strips away the disguise. He knows every contract carries consequence. He knows the most dangerous contracts are the ones unspoken, the habits you repeat, the lies you accept, the limits you agree to without protest. In this sense, you have already made pacts countless times, long before you ever traced a circle. You made a pact with the system when you surrendered your curiosity to dogma. You made a pact with the machine when you traded your hours for wages. You made a pact with silence when you swallowed your voice to remain safe. The Goetia does not create pacts, it reveals them. It hands you the pen and asks, who do you wish to bind yourself to now? In ritual, the pact is not servitude. It is alignment. The magician speaks not as a desperate supplicant, but as an arbiter of law, backed by divine authority invoked through names higher than the spirit itself. The pact is sealed not in weakness but in clarity. I will offer my discipline, my attention, my sacrifice. And in return, you will reveal, you will guide, you will awaken. But beware, the spirits are precise. Do not bend for vague intention. If you ask without clarity, the contract warps. If you promise without will, the bond corrodes and collapses back upon you. Just as a flawed legal contract entangles both parties in confusion, a flawed spiritual pact births distortion, obsession, madness. This is why ritual requires detail. The circle drawn clean, the hour chosen, the invocation exact. These are not superstition, they are clauses. They protect both parties. They define the terms. And in this clarity, the pact becomes a mirror, forcing you to confront what you truly want, what you are truly willing to pay. Because here is the unspoken terror. Most people do not fear spirits, they fear themselves. They fear realizing that they have always been signing contracts with shadows within, binding themselves to lust, to rage, to self-destruction without ever naming it. The Goetia simply demands honesty. You do not summon greed, you admit you have always been serving it. You do not summon desire, you admit it already pulls your strings. The pact brings shadow into the light and gives you the chance to negotiate rather than remain enslaved. This is why pacts are dangerous, not because they bind you to monsters, but because they strip away excuses. When you write your name in vibration, when you declare terms aloud, when you close the ritual with command, you can no longer hide. You have entered into covenant. And the spirit will respond not to your fear or your hope, but to the precision of your word. Power flows where contract is honored. Consequence falls where contract is broken. The old magicians knew this. They were not reckless sorcerers chasing fire. They were lawyers of the unseen, executors of spiritual law. To them, the Goetia was not a fantasy, but a courthouse. The seals were not scribbles, but signatures. The names were not poetry, but legal titles. To step into the circle was to stand in court, to call forth kings and dukes of the invisible, and to enforce agreement. If you faltered, if your authority wavered, if your clarity broke, the pact snapped shut upon you. But if you stood firm, aligned, purified, the spirits bowed. Not to you as a person, but to the architecture you represented. The law you invoked, the chain of command that stretched into the marrow of reality itself. And here lies the revelation. Contracts are everywhere. You cannot escape them. The only choice is whether you sign blindly, feeding a system that drains you, or sign consciously, aligning with forces that awaken you. The pact is the crucible of power. It tests your clarity, your will, your sacrifice. And once sealed, it will either enslave or transform you. The ink is not on paper, it is on your soul. And once you write, the lines cannot be erased. Every pact forces a reckoning, and that reckoning reveals a truth few dare to face. Morality itself is not fixed. The system taught you that good and evil are simple, clear, immutable, that obedience is virtue and rebellion is sin. Yet step into the circle, whisper the names from the Goetia, and that neat binary dissolves like ash and flame. The spirits do not care for human morality. They do not flinch at lust or rage. They do not recoil at ambition. They do not kneel before humility. They are exact forces, archetypes, carved into the hidden geometry of consciousness. To work with them is to confront not a monster, but an inversion of the code you were given as a child. You were told to suppress desire, but Asmodeus will force you to see how your denied hunger shapes every secret thought. You were told to despise conflict, but Amen will show you the necessity of opposition, the fire that forges clarity. You were told to worship obedience, but Lucifer himself embodies rebellion as illumination, the theft of forbidden fire. This is why the church feared the Goetia, why empires demonized witches, why magicians were hunted. Not because they were evil, but because they dared to look at the inverted code and see it not as sin, but as power. Imagine a mirror hung in darkness. When you gaze into it, you do not see the self you present to the world, the polite smile. The docile mask you see, the raw shadow, the instinct buried, the truth society taught you to name evil. Yet that shadow is not a curse, it is fuel, it is possibility. To integrate it is to stop being controlled by it. To repress it is to become its puppet. The inverted moral code whispers, what you call evil is often your own power turned against you. Think of desire. Religions told you it damns, corporations told you it must be commodified. But in the circle it becomes magnetism, creativity, force of manifestation. Think of rage. You were told to suppress it, to shame it, yet in ritual, it sharpens into clarity, a blade that cuts through illusion. Think of ambition. Society calls it arrogance. Unless it serves the system, yet aligned with spirit, it becomes sovereignty, the refusal to remain enslaved. The inverted code terrifies because it strips away the comfort of binaries. No spirit in the Goetia will pat your head for being good. They will not smile upon your obedience. They will show you what you are, unfiltered, and dare you to use it. And that is the true test. Because once you see your shadow as power, no priest, no politician, no master can shame you into submission again. This is why Lucifer stands as the brightest paradox. Cast as Satan, the enemy, the fallen, yet always carrying the torch of knowledge. The archetype of rebellion that brings light to those kept in ignorance. To call upon him is to understand that morality has always been a weapon wielded to keep power concentrated. To invert it is not to glorify cruelty, but to reclaim sovereignty. The system's code says, obey, submit, shrink. The Goetia's code says, see, integrate, expand. One binds you, the other frees you. But freedom is not comfortable. 8. Requires you to own lust without shame, to wield rage without collapse, to channel ambition without corruption. This is alchemy turning shadow into gold. And the crucible is always within. Imagine again the mirror. You see your reflection warp into shapes, horned, winged, crowned, broken. You feel the fear rise. Yet if you keep looking, if you do not turn away, you begin to recognize features. The demon wears your eyes, your mouth, your voice. It is not an intruder, it is you. Inverted code is this recognition. The demon outside is the shadow inside. To command it is to command yourself. To deny it is to remain enslaved to what you cannot name. And this is why the moral order despises magicians. Because a person who has faced their shadow cannot be blackmailed by it. A person who has integrated their lust cannot be shamed. A person who has wielded their rage cannot be manipulated by fear. A person who has embraced rebellion cannot be caged by obedience. They become dangerous, not because they are cruel, but because they are free. The inverted moral code is liberation disguised as blasphemy. It demands you stop playing roles written for you and start writing your own. It demands you step beyond the infantile division of light versus dark and step into the sovereignty of alignment. And once you taste it, the old morality shatters, You no longer fear demons because you recognize them as fragments of your own being. You no longer fear hell because you recognize you have lived in it already. The hell of suppression, the hell of silence, the hell of obedience. And when you walk out of that fire, you do not walk as saint or sinner, you walk as sovereign. This is the meaning hidden in every seal of the Goetia. They are not warnings of monsters to flee, they are mirrors of powers to claim. The inverted code is not corruption, it is revelation. And once revealed, it cannot be unseen. You were told ritual lives only in temples, in hidden chambers, lit by flickering candles, in circles of chalk and whispers of forbidden names. But the truth is more unsettling. Ritual is everywhere, shaping you every day, so pervasive you no longer recognize it. You rise at the same hour to the shriek of alarms, a mechanical bell that tears you from sleep like the tolling of a church chime. You dress according to unspoken codes, uniforms of labor or fashion that mark your allegiance. You march into classrooms where bells divide time into sacred blocks, where oaths are recited, where names of authority are repeated until they etch grooves into the mind. You sit in stadiums where thousands chant in unison, where flags ripple like banners in a temple, where anthems summon tears as surely as invocations summon spirits. You kneel in pews, you stand for pledges, you scroll through feeds where symbols flash and repeat. Each image a miniature sigil, each repetition a binding spell. This is not accident, it is designed. Ritual has never vanished, it has been repackaged. Ancients burned incense, the moderns pump advertising jingles. The ancients traced seals, the moderns brand logos onto your subconscious. The ancients invoke names, the moderns repeat slogans. Ritual is the engine of reality. Programs belief, directs emotion, anchors identity. The only difference is intent. The rituals of the system are not meant to awaken, they are meant to contain. They hypnotize you into agreement, binding you to roles you never chose. Work, consume, obey, repeat. Every commercial jingle is a chant. Every corporate logo is a sigil. Every breaking news cycle is a liturgy. You live not outside ritual, but inside one massive ritual that never ends. And the irony is that you mock magicians as primitive while living as the most ritualized generation in history. The Goetia exposes this inversion. It shows you ritual not as a trap, but as a tool. To step into the circle is to hijack the mechanism. You choose the words, not the slogans. You trace the symbols, not the logos. You focus emotion not to consume, but to command. The robes, the candles, the geometry, they are not superstition. They are scaffolding for the psyche, triggers for the subconscious, ways of declaring, I am no longer passive, I am deliberate. When a magician lights a candle, it is not plate, it is signal. The psyche shifts, the inner world stirs, the veil thins. And when that state deepens, the spirit responds. Ritual is alignment. It takes scattered will and condenses it into laser focus. This is why rituals have always been feared, because those who command them command attention, and attention is the root of power. Look around. Why do politicians hold rallies with chants and banners? Why do religions demand weekly gatherings? Why do corporations spend fortunes on slogans? They know the secret, the Goetia whispers. Repetition plus emotion equals programming. They use it to bind you. The magician uses it to free himself. But liberation requires honesty. You must admit you have always been ritualized. You've always participated in ceremonies of obedience, in liturgies of consumption, in invocations of distraction. Only then can you invert the script. Only then can you reclaim ritual as creation rather than containment. Imagine this shift. The anthem that once bound you to nation becomes the chant that binds you to intention. The logo that once colonized your mind becomes the sigil you designed to awaken forgotten power. The endless scrolling of feeds becomes the deliberate repetition of sacred names. Ritual is everywhere, but when you seize it, the everywhere becomes yours. And this is where the terror lies for the system. Because a person who sees through the rituals of obedience cannot be controlled by them. A person who knows that symbols or sigils and chants or spells and ceremonies or programming becomes immune. They stop saluting flags without question. They stop repeating slogans without thought. Stop feeding their blood into altars of labor without awareness. They begin to direct ritual outward to command rather than obey. And that shift ripples. It spreads. Because ritual is contagious. When one person changes their rhythm, others feel it. When one voice breaks the chant, others notice. When one symbol is inverted, others awaken. This is why the magician is always painted as villain, as heretic, as rebel. It's not because he serves demons, but because he breaks spells. He stops being ritualized and becomes the ritualist. And once you taste that power, the rituals of the system feel like chains, cheap imitations of what you were born to wield. You begin to see every movement as ceremony, every gesture as invocation, every word as spell. And in that awareness, nothing is ordinary again. Even silence becomes liturgy, even breath becomes prayer, even thought becomes command. Ritual is everywhere. The only question is, are you the instrument or are you the conductor? Once the illusion cracks, it cannot be repaired. Once you glimpse the machinery humming beneath the world, you cannot unsee it. Awakening is not a gentle dawn, but a rupture, a tearing of veils, a shudder in the bones. Suddenly you notice how every rhythm of your life has been choreographed. The school bells that shaped your childhood were not neutral. They were training, conditioning you to march by signal. The pledges you spoke with hand to heart were not innocent. They were spells binding identity to authority. The endless glow of screens you now cradle in your palms is not mere entertainment. It is ritual, repetition, invocation of images that siphon attention. You realize you were never outside ritual, never outside pact, never outside sacrifice. You were always inside a system, a cathedral without walls, a liturgy disguised as normal life. And the realization burns. Because you see now that what was sold to you as freedom was a cage built of symbols, contracts, and repetitions, so subtle you mistook them for choice. Awakening to the system is vertigo. It is walking through a city and seeing not billboards, but sigils, not advertisements, but incantations, not parades, but processions of obedience. The world shimmers like a stage, every act choreographed, every gesture rehearsed, and you stand at the edge, no longer participant, no longer hypnotized. The first reflex is terror. Because if everything is ritual, if everything is spell, then where is truth? But then the deeper revelation arrives. Truth was never outside. Truth was always waiting inside you, the unbroken seal, the living geometry. The Goetia whispers this heresy. You were the ritual all along. The circle of protection, the triangle of manifestation. The words of command, they were never external trappings. They were mirrors of your own architecture. The spirits you called were shadows of your psyche, archetypes buried in marrow. The sacrifices you offered were veils torn from illusion. The contracts you signed were choices made in silence long before you named them. Awakening is to finally claim authorship. You realize you have been a background character in someone else's spell, following scripts written by priests, by kings, by corporations, by algorithms. But the moment you step out, the moment you seize ritual as tool rather than trap, you begin to write your own. And reality bends. Not dramatically, not with lightning crashing and throne shattering, but subtly, like air shifting before a storm. Synchronicities multiply, symbols rearrange. Conversations echo with hidden meaning. You see patterns where others see noise. You dream with clarity that bleeds into waking. This is not madness, it is alignment. The system cannot hold you once you awaken, because its power was never in chains, but in consent. Never in prisons, but in agreements. And when you withdraw consent, when you rewrite contracts, when you redirect sacrifice, its hold dissolves. That is why awakening is feared. A society of sleepers can be managed. A society of magicians cannot. Because they no longer beg for permission. They no longer tremble before shadows. They no longer worship obedience. They see the invisible, and once seen, it loses power. Imagine standing in ritual, not as supplicant, but as sovereign. The circle beneath your feet no longer a prison, but a throne. The words on your tongue no longer borrowed prayers, but declarations from the marrow. The spirits who appear no longer threats, but reflections, catalysts, allies. Awakening is this shift, from being the object of ritual to being the subject, from being programmed to programming, from being used to using. And with that shift comes danger, because the system does not tolerate those who wake. It mocks them as mad, labels them as dangerous, exiles them as heretics. Yet beneath the fear is the recognition. Awakened ones cannot be consumed. They do not pour their blood blindly into the machine. They do not sign contracts unconsciously. They do not chant without knowing what the words mean. They choose. And choice is the rarest magic of all. Awakening does not end with knowledge, it ends with embodiment. You begin to carry yourself differently. Your eyes no longer dart for approval. Your voice no longer trembles to speak truth. Your presence unsettles because it cannot be predicted. Those around you feel it, even if they cannot name it. They sense the fire behind your gaze, the silence heavy as ritual, the gravity of someone who knows their own shadow and does not run from it. This is the gift of the Goetia, when stripped of fear and distortion. It is not a book of demons, it is a manual for sovereignty. It teaches you to face contracts, to embrace sacrifice, to invert morality, to reclaim ritual, and finally to awaken. To see the system not as unbreakable cage, but as fragile illusion. To recognize that you were never powerless, only persuaded to forget. To remember that you are both seal and spirit, invocation and invoked. And once you remember, the spell of ordinary life shatters. You awaken not to escape the system, but to rewrite it. To carry the forbidden fire not as curse, but as crown. To walk as ritual incarnate, living geometry, unbound. The circle is drawn, but not yet closed. Another seal waits in the dark. Another whisper coils beneath silence. Will you dare to look deeper, to open what they told you to fear? Comment your thoughts, subscribe, and step with us into the next forbidden ritual.